Welcome back to When the Dutch Went to Space. We arrived at episode number 16, called International Space Stations. And we are going to see quite a few of them in this episode. But before we start with all that, we arrive at the 12th of August in 1968. And you are looking at another Bobby spacecraft. For those of you who didn't watch the previous episodes, the Bobby series is a rover targeting the moon. And it's named after Kuifje's companion from the Tintin comic stores. And we've tried this several times before, as you can see by the naming scheme. Bobby C4, meaning it's the third iteration or the third generation of rover that we're sending, and the fourth one in total. It has a completely new design. Well, not completely, but it's got a completely new approach to the wheels. It's got a new approach to how we shall be landing it and how many engines we are using in the final descent stage. All of this is to avoid all the problems that we've been having with the wheels itself. So some of them exploded on landing, some of them broke upon landing, some of them skid across the surface like a slide, which is not a surprise because the way the developers have modeled wheels in KSP is basically a skid with zero friction and a rotating animation on top of that. And forum user, I forgot his name, it starts with a J. Anyway, he literally reinvented the wheels. And we are using his scheme on this particular vehicle. And you can see us going for the final approach and landing. We're still using the Lloyd and descent stage. I think we've been using that for about 3 to 4 years now. So that definitely paid out to tool all those equipment and tanks. You can also see me move a little bit sideways, which means we're trying targeted landing. Because the next landings that we have to do, the next manned landings that we have to do, are actually targeted landings, and it's good to get some experience with finding your bearings on the moon and changing the inclination before you actually land. You can see the lander itself kicking in and then removing the final bit of vertical and horizontal velocity. We really need to get this down, and I left on the markers for a moment so you can actually see me get down pretty close to it. And we need to do this because we will need to land within 1 kilometer of our target zone in a manned landing. So it's good to get the experience down. Anyway, you can see me go down for the final landing burn, and the wheels are wobbling a little bit, but we'll be fine. We'll be fine. I'm sure we'll be fine. We actually got 6 descent engines on it, but in the final phase we are able to disable 2 of them so we can optimize our TWR or thrust to weight ratio. Because if you have too powerful of an engine and your tanks are getting empty, it tends to bounce off the surface. But we managed to thrust, and we can throttle down the other 4 engines, and we will have a soft touchdown that shall not be breaking our wheels for the first time in history. And I'm calling that a success. You can see the tiny landing scheme that is now attached to it rather than built into the rover, and I thought, well, we can just drive over it, but I should have tested this perhaps a little bit more. And the descent tank is actually caught between the wheels, but it doesn't seem to affect the rover that much. I then headed over to those lovely rocks off in the distance in the hope that I could sort of wheel over them and then perhaps get rid of the descent stage, but alas, that did not happen. There is a trick that we can be using, which is the debris cleanup. Like, not all the debris will stay around, and it will actually get cleaned up to save memory. And I guess we'll be using that, or I'll try to jump it around a little bit using the thrusters. Anyway, on September the 9th, 1968, we are launching ECS. And if you want to know what that stands for, it's called the European Communication System. And we are actually trying to build a geostationary network that is at a geostationary altitude, but not on a geostationary inclination. And that is because Surya Base is extremely busy at the moment with all the lunar activity, so we are using the Tessel launch facilities, which are of course at 54 degrees inclination. So it's going to be a geo orbit, but so it will appear as the satellite is exactly above the same spot when you look at the longitude of the spacecraft. So it will stay on the same bearing or the same point on the horizon, but it will move up and down from the perspective on somebody on the ground, actually below the horizon. And to counter this effect, we are going to launch 2 geostationary frameworks, and we're going to launch them 12 hours apart. And by doing that, you will always have one satellite above the horizon and one satellite that is below the horizon. And hopefully this will give us a complete coverage and better control over our spacecraft, because I notice we are still losing control, especially when we're launching from Surya. And the moment we've passed Australia, you have this big stretch of water which has obviously very few antennas to pick up our signals. And so we're hoping that this will remedy that particular situation. Unfortunately, as we will find out, our antenna power is not that great, and it will still be tough to get a connection. But anyway, we get the experience of putting stuff in a geostationary orbit. Actually, it's moving to a transfer orbit first. So we're boosting this stuff into a 52 million kilometer by 145, and then we use the kickstart that you've seen to put it into a 52 million kilometer by a 32 million kilometer, which is a resonant orbit, meaning it will pass around something like every 24 to 5, like roughly 8 hours. And 8 hours apart, 16 hours. So it will drop off a satellite, spin around, drop off the other one, spin around, drop off the third one. And that will put them all in roughly 120 degrees separation, creating a nice triangle. It's not important to get the altitudes exactly right. What is important is that you get your orbital period the same. So this is where you can see me insert all the different satellites. And again, in plus 45 degrees and minus 55 degrees. So, and the orbital period should be 23 hours, 56 minutes and 4 seconds. So, and then they're 12 hours apart. So this is the B satellite, and in a moment you shall be seeing the third satellite for each of the stages, and that will complete our network. Obviously it would be better to do it in a geostationary at 0 inclination, but I sort of like this 2 disks that give us full coverage of what we're trying to achieve. And here we go. This looks like a nice communication network. Next up, October 5, 1968. You're looking at Bobby D7. Hey, hang on, what happened to Bobby 5 and 6? Well, number 5 crashed, and then number 6 we scrapped basically because, well, there are some subtle changes that we have to make to the design, and the Leuten stage is really underpowered. And that's actually why we are launching it now on a Europa 2 rather than a Europa 1. Yes, it's going to take us longer to build these things, and it's more expensive, but the Europa 2 is a very reliable vehicle that can punch quite a bit of its weight, and is actually pushing lots of tonnage into lunar orbit. This is the translunar insertion, and as you can guess, this actually gives us a lot of more power to land something on the moon and actually change inclinations, because inclination changes turn out to be very expensive. So I'm going to experiment during this particular transfer with changing inclination somewhere midway and having the orbit already inclined by the time I reach the moon, and that will prove out to be far more effective. Anyway, the transfer stage is super reliable, and currently you can see it boosting into lunar orbit and revealing the new rover design. The rover design is similar to what we did for Bobby, but it's again using a different set of wheels. It is longer, it's a little bit heavier, has some additional instruments, but most of all, it is carrying a seat, a command seat. And obviously, it can rove unmanned, but the idea is that we are starting to build up experience with sending unmanned rovers to the moon that can be used by astronauts at a later point in time. And of course the Americans will bring the rovers with them, but you've seen our lander. Our lander is very, very tiny, so it cannot carry the additional weight. And I've made additional designs, but those would require way heavier launch vehicles. And henceforth we've tried to separate this. The scheme is not that weird actually. When you look at the Artemis program that the Americans are doing today, it will follow a similar scheme where they will deliver unpressurized and pressurized rovers before we actually send astronauts to the moon. And I believe the Soviet lunar base concept, like this Vesta base, also was based on this same idea. So for the final few meters of the descent, we ditch the main landing stage and we focus on what we built into the rover. You can see my GPU is struggling to draw all the pretty rocks, and as a result we are a little bit late, and for some obvious reason unknown to me, these wheels seem to be made out of gummy balls, or I don't know. But hey, textbook landing. Any landing you can walk away for. For some reason the wheels did not break, whereas in the previous iterations wheels would break when you looked at them. So I'm really happy with this design, and it proves to be very maneuverable. It has great traction also on inclined slopes. It has all these additional instruments, and it's making its way to the most likely landing site for a manned landing. Depends a bit on how we do our TLI insertion. For now, it sits and observes. Next up, in November 11, we're launching Matahari, and this is a classified launch for the Dutch military. And it's named Matahari for, maybe obvious reason, maybe not. Matahari was a famous Dutch spy, or allegedly she was a spy. She lived in Indonesia for a long part of her life at the start of the century, and she became a famous exotic dancer. And she danced in Paris and in Berlin, and allegedly she was a spy for both, which didn't turn out too well for her. So either she was not that successful as a spy, or perhaps she was not that much of a spy at all. Anyway, the French executed her, and so that's not quite a success story. But officially this launch is classified. We're launching something into polar orbit, and for now it's guesswork what it is. But maybe from the design in the distance you can tell that it looks a little bit like a space station. A space station with something attached to it that looks suspiciously like a camera. Officially the launch will be classified as a loss, and the purpose of the payload is of course unknown. But maybe we'll see her again in a future episode. Who knows? For now, it's time for some other space stations which seem to have been built on a similar template. The European Space Agency is running most of the launches from our great airbase in Indonesia, but you've also seen lots of modules from individual countries, in particular the Dutch, because hey, the series is called When the Dutch Went to Space. But it doesn't mean that there are no other space agencies around, far from it. So what you're looking at now is Italy's contribution to ESA, being the Fermi lab, of course named after Fermi the physicist. And if you haven't heard of Fermi, you can Google the Fermi paradox, which talks about alien life and why it should be out there or why it shouldn't be out there. It's interesting stuff. For now, you can see us launch this thing into a rendezvous orbit with the Japanese module. Remember, we left it in orbit last time when we deorbited the old space station. And we said, well, the Japanese module was so new and we weren't really ready to ditch it yet. And we could use the attached Jules Verne stage for maneuverability. And the Fermilab actually has something really cool, which is a space tug. And the space tug was an idea I think it was based in the post-Apollo program or Apollo applications program. And it basically is a small unit that has propellant and thrusters and its own control system, and it allows to move around in space and dock elements together rather than having all elements being extremely smart, like with the Russian space stations, where all of the modules, for example, for the Mir stations, all of the modules had control computers that would allow to maneuver in space and thrusters and stuff like that. But the Americans did it differently by using the space shuttle, which had this electronics inside and relatively dumb space station modules. And we're using sort of a hybrid approach. The Fermilab will be joined by Spacelab A. For some reason I forgot to record that, which is really unfortunately, which is the ESA core of the station. And Fermi will dock with it. The Japanese module have docked with it as well. And so this is really a space station episode. In moving into 1969, we're launching another space station, but this is a really tiny one. This is based on what the Japanese have been building for our initial space station, but even lighter. So this is not a laboratory, this is a habitation module. This is the Gateway habitation module, and actually it is so light that we can launch it on a standard Europa 2 rocket and carry it all the way to the moon, do the orbital insertion in the lunar plane, do a couple of correction burns, and match velocity with the Gateway system, which, as you may remember, was our backup in case something would be going wrong during our lunar landing. It provides power and supplies for about 30 days. But people would have to live in the Haddock capsule, which is of course extremely cramped, and living in there for a month is asking a lot from the crew. So we're sending up a small habitation module to give them a little bit more leg room. In addition, once you move your pilots over to the habitation module, we might be able to shut down the avionics on our spacecraft, saving up tons and tons of power. Regardless, you see us do the lunar insertion burn, and after that we are going to make a Heyman transfer burn, because I finally figured out how to work inclinations, and the insertion burn actually brought us at almost a zero inclination with the space station, and this is good news. And if it turns out that I really mastered this part, it's gonna help us when we are going to do targeted landing on the lunar surface. You see a familiar space dock carrying around a tiny lab to the Gateway station, which still has its solar panels pointed towards the sun. I'm not sure if we ever are going to send a crew over there, and it being a rescue station but who knows? There is a contract to send people to an orbit around the moon. And maybe if we build a next generation spacecraft, before we actually start landing stuff on the moon, they just fly over here in orbit. But here we go. And we can now deorbit the space dock and get rid of all the parts. Reducing the part count will speed up your the performance of the game, because it doesn't have to render all these parts and run all the physics calculations. It's the 10th of August 1969, and we're launching Haddock E14. 14 already. And this time we have a guest on board. Yes, we have a very special international mission going up. So mission commander is Ian Hughes. He's a veteran of the space program, being up in space several times already. And he's been with us since the early beginning. But we also have a mission specialist on board, and her name is Valentina Tereshkova. And Valentina Tereshkova was actually the first woman in space from the USSR, and she went into space a mere 3 months after our own Maaike van den Berg, which was the first woman in space. So we stole that from them in this alternative reality. In real life, Valentina never flew again. despite being an awesome pilot. But in our reality, she became an exchange scientist, and she's flying to Space Lab Alpha, which is designed to be an international space station. So you can already see them approaching it. You can see all the flags on it. The Americans will make contributions, the Russians, the Japanese, the Italians, the Dutch, of course, and maybe the whole of the European Union. And we can see us all tucked together. We've got a fresh Jules Verne supply craft docked. It's about a month after the Americans have landed on the moon, and other nations are catching up, and some nations are willing to seek out cooperation. Valentina is not without reason on our International Space Station. She is there to oversee the docking of the Russian contribution, or the Russian visit. We haven't really decided on it yet. But Salyut 1, being launched from Plesetsk, is in an almost... could be launched in the same inclination as Space Lab Alpha. And to make all the docking work, we attached an additional orbital node to the head, which is probably something they would do. Build an interface module out of stuff they have lying around. In this case, an orbital module from the Soyuz. And on the one end, it features the Soyuz docking mechanism that is attached to Salyut 1, and on the other hand, we have the Dutch or the ESA's docking mechanism that is standardized on the Haddock spacecraft. I've added a couple of additional thrusters, so Salyut only had thrusters on the rear, and I think we need a couple more to move this thing around. It's heavy and huge, so this thing weighs close to 20 tons. And it's launched on a Proton, which means that the Soviets have access to Proton. And maybe in our alternative reality, they spend a bit more on the lunar program. Maybe they did the Soyuz ABV program, which was a plan devised by Korolev to do a cislunar mission based on the Soyuz launcher, which is extremely reliable. And of course, we've had a cislunar mission based on Proton and Zond, I think, or Soyuz. Maybe it was a modified Soyuz, that's something I remember. And in real life they sent some turtles around the moon, but maybe they sent a cosmonaut around the moon. It's not outside the realm of possibility. The main reason why it didn't happen in real life is because the early Proton launches were super unreliable and super toxic, so you don't want to have people on top of a toxic rocket based on hypergolic fuels, and also a big chance it explodes. That seems like a very bad idea. But had the rocket been very reliable, yeah, there's no reason why you would not do that. So in our alternative reality, the Russians are relying on Proton a lot more. And once they're docked, it is time to shuffle some things around. I've added in another docking port to Salyut, which allows the Japanese module to be plugged in there. And we're also, somewhere is the Jules Verne supply craft floating around. We'll redock that one as well. And you can see me struggle with MacJab. For some reason, I cannot find out why, but I can't make it dock. If anybody has an idea why I'm struggling in RSS and RP-1 with MacJab autopilot, please tell me. But I can dock manually as well. So moving Jules Verne over to its parking spot. Look at that sunset. I'm pretty sure that the US also wants to be part of this space station. I'm really sure. At the moment, they're very much focused on getting Apollo 12 ready to go to the moon. And I forgot which one brought the rover. I think it was 14 when they brought the rover. And maybe they have plans to send up an empty LEM, like a LEM that does not leave, and turn the top part of the LEM into a base. That would be interesting. Like you could use the Saturn V, you could use the landing engines, have less fuel, and really do something special. Let's figure that out in the next episode. Until then, I hope you have a great time, and we see you again somewhere in the future.